Deciphering the IHSS Notice of Action. So what is a Notice of Action? So a Notice of Action, it's a letter from a state agency that tells you whether or not you've been approved for the thing that you applied for, whether your services are being changed or terminated. In the case of IHSS, if you have been approved for IHSS, the Notice of Action will be this giant mass of numbers that tells you exactly how many hours you get in each possible category of IHSS services. So the Notice of Action breaks down the categories into domestic services, which we don't usually get for minors, into related services, which limited availability for minors. We have non-medical personal care services, and this is the thing like ambulation and care and dressing and all the individual ADLs that you assist your recipient with. And then we have accompaniment, protective supervision, and paramedical services. If you have received this document and looked at it and said, I don't even know where to start, you are not alone. They don't, it can be a very confusing document the first time you see it, or even the second or third or fourth time you see it. So what I've done here is we're going to take a look at each little block on here and see exactly what you can expect to find there. And there are other pages in the Notice of Action, so we will talk about those as well. So giant mess of numbers, how do we read it? Okay, so the first section is at the top. I have redacted all the identifying information from the notices that were shared with me for this presentation. So you'll see the date that the change is effective. You'll see the total number of hours that your child has been awarded. And you'll also see whether this is an increase or a decrease from the last assessment. So let's look at the next section. So this top column, the first column just tells you which category of services you're dealing with. The second column tells you the amount of service that your child needs. This is not necessarily the amount of service that IHSS is going to provide, and we'll talk about this later, but it's the total amount of service that your child needs. This column, the adjustment for others who share the home proration, the main area where we would see that, where we used to see that in families with more than one recipient were in protective supervision, because they used to prorate protective supervision for children living in the same household. And I believe they no longer do that. The amount of service you need, sometimes that will decrease. And again, we'll talk about that, sorry. This is the column where people often have questions, services you refuse or get from others. So this column is going to be, for our children, mostly services that are expected to take place at school. So if you have toileting hours or you have meal hours and they're considering that your child eats one of their meals at school, or that some of that toileting time happens at school and the school takes care of it, and especially with protective supervision, as we'll see, they will put that in the column for services that other people are providing, because that's happening during the school day. And then the last column is the amount of service you can get, and they'll show you the current number, they'll show you the previous number, and whether that was a change, an increase or a decrease. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this category, because you generally will not see hours in domestic services, because children are generally not eligible for those. Related services depend on the situation and the age of the child. IHSS, if you've seen the Functional Skills Index, you know that they're very generous with how old children are expected to be before they do certain chores for themselves, like laundry and meal prep. I think laundry is like 17 or something. And so you might see some services here if there's extraordinary need for laundry, or if the child's older. I believe the child in this Notice of Action is a little bit older, and so they qualify for some of the laundry assistance. But generally speaking, these are mostly services that parents are expected to provide to their child for most ages. Okay, so this is where a lot of our this is where the personal assistance services are. And this is where you're helping your child with activities of daily living, ADLs. And so you have, I mean, you can see, I'm not going to read them all off, but you have bowel and bladder care, you have the bathing, the dressing, the hygiene, the accompaniment to and from. These are two separate categories, the personal services and accompaniment, but I put them together because they're all kind of added in the same section. But all of these, you'll see, again, you'll see the hours that you need. Usually the hours that you can get are the same, and then you'll see any hours that were subtracted for school. So as you can see here, they took out 10 minutes a week from feeding, for presumably for the time that the child is at school. This is the part that everyone has questions about, right? Because so we've got protective supervision and paramedical services. Protective supervision, the total amount of services needed is always going to be 168, because protective supervision means that the child needs 24/7 supervision, and there's 168 hours in a week. That is not the number of hours IHSS is going to give you. Okay, so we're going to start with the 168 hours that are needed. And then the next column, the amount of services that you can get, is going to be 168 minus all of the other services above and paramedical services, because they presume that if you're providing some other IHSS service, you are supervising them at the same time. So they're going to subtract from 168 all of the other services, including paramedical services, personal care, everything else gets subtracted. So in this case, that leaves 156 hours and 36 minutes left. Then they have subtracted 34 hours a week for school. So they've subtracted 34 hours here. And then you go to this new number, which is 4502, and you're like, where did that come from? So here's where it came from. So when you get protective supervision, they generally allot 195 hours per month for that. So it's your total hours plus 195 hours for the protective supervision piece. So IHSS considers a month to be 4.33 weeks. That's just their automatic calculation for a month. So 195 divided by 4.33 is 45 hours and 2 minutes. And that's where this random number comes from that we have no idea what it means. Okay, so this number 4502, that can change mostly when you have a lot of other services, because you can't go over the maximum of 283. And I'm going to show you in a minute what a different notice of action might look like. So here's a notice of action, and you can see right under the text block here that this person has 65 hours a week of paramedical services, and so they've subtracted all the other non-medical personal care services and the paramedical services from protective supervision, and then they've left it with 90/41 is what's left. But because all of the other care services and paramedical services add up to over the allotted amount, there's no protective supervision hours here. And if they were, and I can tell you that on previous years, this same person was awarded maybe like 3 protective supervision hours, because the total other hours added up to like 3 hours less than the maximum. And so it's that protective supervision amount is just going to fluctuate, because it's just going to bring you, if you're over 20 hours per week and you're severely impaired, it's just going to bring you up to the maximum hours per week. So because they never pay for 24/7 care. But the presumption is that if you're doing all these other services, you're supervising your child already. And so they're just going to bring you up to the maximum. The last section here, which adds up all the hours you can get in 1 week, which is 5626 on this notice of action, and then multiply it by 4.33. It's always 4.33 to get from weekly to monthly. And then that's your total monthly hours, 244 and 22 minutes. So on the back of this page is going to be your hearing weights. So they'll always be like what your hearing weights are in a little form that you can make a copy of and send it, or you can call, or you can do it online. And we have other articles on how to file an appeal for IHSS and what to expect in that process. So page 3 is where you will find notes. And so if there have been any changes in your child's service, that will usually be listed on page 3 of the notice of action. It'll also often tell you where your funding source, what your funding source is. because IHSS is a combination of federal and state funds, and there are different rules about who can be provider based on whether it's federal funds or state funds, and which grant is coming from, which program is coming from. And so it'll generally tell you, and for a parent or spousal provider, it's usually one specific program. So you'll see that on this page. You'll see any changes that were happening. And you will also see unmet need. So that notice of action that I showed you with all the paramedical services hours, those hours actually added up to more than 283. And so if the service hours, and this is not including protective supervision, if all of the service hours add up to more than 283, you want to make sure that that's still documented. Like don't have them say, well, we're not going to give you any more hours because it's not going to make a difference because you're already at the max hours. No, if your child needs those hours, they should be documented. And here's why. Every once in a while, there's a state budget cut. And it's happened in the past that they have gone to make budget cuts to the IHSS program. There have been cuts across the board, a certain % cut in hours across the board. But if somebody has documented unmet need, in the past, those cuts have come out of the unmet need first. And so if you have documented unmet need, that in the past, at least, that has helped people not lose as many hours if there has been a cut, like a % cut in hours, but that has been able to come out of the unmet need. Now, that's not a guarantee that it'll continue to be like that, or that has been like that every time, but it is something to consider. You never want them to say, well, they need this, but I'm just not going to add it because it doesn't matter because you're already at the maximum hours. If your child has documented need, you should make sure that it's documented on the notice of action. And so here at the bottom, you can see that they added up all the services and there's a total of 51 hours and 47 minutes of unmet need per month. And you just want to make sure that that's documented. That's generally going to be for people who have a lot of paramedical services, because people with significant medical impairments and who are on a vent, on feeding tubes, on oxygen, there can be a lot of time involved in that provision of that kind of care. So the next pages, and that's really the most confusing part. Like, we're just going to review what the rest of the pages look like, so you know kind of what they are. So the next couple pages are just a description of what each category is and what it entails. And then you'll see okay, this is actually one more section that sometimes people are confused about. In the notice of action, there will be a provider letter that is also sent to the provider, which means if you're the parent provider, you'll get 2 copies of it. It tells you the total number of authorized hours per month. And then it tells you the weekly maximum, which is 6106 in this case. That is not the number of hours that you are going to log every week. What that is the number of hours that you can log in a single week without incurring a violation. So the total number of hours, the average hours that you're gonna get is the total monthly hours divided by 4.33. That's going to be the average hours, because they figured out that's your weekly hours times roughly 4 1/3 weeks in a month, right? But if you're figuring out the weekly maximum, because sometimes things shift, like sometimes the schedule shifts and you provide more hours in one day and less hours in another. The number of hours that you can log in 1 week without getting a violation from IHSS for going over hours is the total number of hours per month divided by 4. Do not expect to log that many hours every week. You will go over your time. And the last couple of pages, just they show the description of services again, and then they just put a little X or a check mark next to the ones that have been authorized on this notice of action. So that is the notice of action. I hope it's a little bit less confusing now.